Captain Kim Taemin gripped his command chair as red warning lights flashed across the bridge of the exploration vessel, New Dawn. The experimental faster-than-light drive had been humanity's greatest achievement, promising to open the galaxy to human exploration. But something had gone terribly wrong during their first long-distance jump. "Captain, the navigation computer is completely fried," shouted Navigator Park Ji-Hai from her station. Her fingers flew across the control panel, trying to make sense of the readings. "We're not anywhere near the Kepler colony. I don't even recognize these star patterns." Engineer Lee Dongwoo's voice crackled through the intercom from the engine room. "Sir, we've got massive system failures throughout the ship. The jump drive overloaded and took half our electronics with it. I'm running emergency repairs, but we're sitting ducks out here." Kim stared at the main view screen, watching strange constellations he had never seen before. Earth's databases contained maps of thousands of star systems, but this region of space was completely unknown. They had jumped further than any human had ever traveled, and now they were lost in the void with a crippled ship. "Captain!" Park's voice rose with alarm. "I'm detecting multiple contacts approaching fast. They're big and they're definitely not human ships." The view screen shifted to tactical display, showing dozens of massive vessels converging on their position. These weren't the smooth, rounded designs of human spacecraft. Instead, they were angular and predatory, painted in deep crimson with golden markings that looked almost ceremonial. "They're hailing us," reported Communications Officer Han Min-seo, "but I can't understand the language. The translation computers are trying to process it, but it's unlike anything in our databases." Kim's military training kicked in. He had spent years in Earth's defense forces before joining the exploration program, and he recognized aggressive positioning when he saw it. "All hands prepare for possible combat. Lee, I need whatever power you can give me for engines and shields." The alien ships moved with practiced precision, forming a perfect encirclement around the damaged human vessel. Each craft was at least 3 times the size of the New Dawn, bristling with weapon systems that looked both advanced and deadly. Kim could see smaller fighter craft launching from the larger ships, swarming around them like angry insects. "Sir, they're scanning us," Han reported. "Deep scans going right through our hull. They know everything about our ship now." One of the alien vessels moved closer, and Kim got his first clear look at their pursuers. The ships were beautiful, in a terrifying way, with swept-back wings and a design that reminded him of ancient Earth dragons. Gold and crimson patterns covered their hulls in intricate designs that spoke of a civilization with a long, proud history. "Captain, I'm getting something from the translation computer," Han said. "It's rough, but I think they're demanding our surrender. They keep using a word that translates to something like empire or dominion." Kim made a quick decision. Surrender meant capture, and they had no idea what these aliens wanted with them. But the New Dawn was an exploration vessel, not a warship. They couldn't fight their way out of this situation with conventional tactics. "Park, give me everything you know about the local space," he ordered. "Asteroids, gas clouds, anything we can use. Lee, I need the engines online now, even if they're running at half power." "Captain, there's a dense asteroid field about 20,000 kilometers to starboard," Park reported. "Lots of metallic debris, probably from an old mining operation or a destroyed planet." Kim smiled grimly. He had spent 5 years working asteroid mining ships before joining the exploration program, dancing between floating rocks while extracting precious metals. Those skills had seemed useless for deep space exploration, but now they might save their lives. "Han, send them a message. Tell them we're peaceful explorers who got lost. Maybe we can buy some time." Kim turned to his pilot. "Choi Jae-sung, prepare for emergency acceleration toward that asteroid field. We're going to show these aliens how humans handle impossible situations." The alien commander's response came back immediately, and even through the rough translation, the contempt was clear. They considered humans primitive creatures who had wandered into their territory by accident. They expected easy capture and quick submission. They were about to learn how wrong they were about humanity. Dr. Yoon Soo-jin had studied alien languages her entire career, but nothing had prepared her for the complexity of Valyrian speech. The reptilian aliens used a combination of vocal sounds, body postures, and even scent markers to communicate. As the human crew was escorted through the massive corridors of the Imperial Palace, she worked frantically to understand the basic protocols they would need to survive the coming encounter. The throne room of Emperor Vextar was designed to crush the spirit of anyone who entered. Towering columns stretched up into darkness, carved with scenes of Valyrian conquests across 1,000 worlds. The ceiling disappeared into shadows, making visitors feel tiny and insignificant. Gold and crimson banners hung from the walls, each one representing a species that had submitted to imperial rule. Captain Kim Tae-min walked beside Dr. Yoon, his eyes taking in every detail of the chamber. Behind them, the rest of the crew stayed close together, their faces showing curiosity rather than the fear their captors expected. Navigator Park Ji-hai whispered observations about the architectural techniques used to create such an intimidating space. Engineer Lee Dongwoo quietly noted the advanced lighting systems and structural engineering that made the massive room possible. The Emperor himself sat on a throne carved from a single piece of black stone, elevated high above the floor so that all visitors had to crane their necks to look at him. Vexatar was an impressive figure, even by Valyrian standards. His scales were deep emerald green with gold markings, and his eyes held the cold intelligence of a predator who had never known defeat. Ceremonial armor covered his massive frame, each piece inscribed with the names of conquered worlds. Around the throne, dozens of Valyrian nobles stood in perfect formation, their own scales bearing the colors and patterns that indicated their rank within the imperial hierarchy. Guards in ornate armor lined the walls, their weapons ready but held in ceremonial positions that spoke of absolute confidence in their emperor's power. Dr. Yoon had managed to piece together enough of the language to understand the basic ceremony. The emperor would speak, and they were expected to throw themselves face down on the floor while acknowledging his supreme authority over all life in the galaxy. Any species that refused this ritual was considered rebellious and dealt with harshly. But when the moment came, Captain Kim simply stepped forward and gave a respectful bow, the kind he might offer to a fellow officer or distinguished colleague. "Your Imperial Majesty," he said through Dr. Yoon's translation, "I am Captain Kim Tae-min of the human exploration vessel, New Dawn. These are my crew members, and we come in peace." The silence that followed was deafening. Several nobles gasped audibly, and the guards shifted their weapons slightly. No one had ever addressed the Emperor as an equal. The very concept was so foreign to Valyrian culture that many of them couldn't process what they had just witnessed. Communications Officer Han Min-seo made things worse by stepping forward with genuine enthusiasm. She had always been fascinated by alien cultures, and finding herself in the heart of a galactic empire was like a dream come true for her. "Your Majesty, this is incredible. How long has your civilization existed? How many star systems do you control? The architecture here suggests a culture that values both beauty and power. Are those conquest banners? What's the story behind that? One with the blue and silver pattern?" Dr. Yoon frantically translated Han's rapid-fire questions, watching the Emperor's expression shift from surprise to confusion to something that might have been amusement. In Valyrian culture, only the Emperor was allowed to ask questions during formal audiences. Lesser beings were expected to speak only when spoken to, and then only to provide the answers their superiors wanted to hear. The cultural misunderstanding reached its peak when Imperial champion Gorthak, a massive Valyrian warrior whose scales bore the scars of 100 battles, stepped forward from his position beside the throne. His voice boomed through the chamber as he issued the ritual challenge that Dr. Yoon had hoped to avoid. "These creatures mock our traditions and show disrespect to our emperor," Gorthak declared. "I challenge them to prove their worth in the ancient way. Let their strongest warrior face me in the circle of honor, and we shall see if their arrogance matches their courage." Pilot Choi Jae-sung immediately stepped forward before Captain Kim could stop him. At barely average height for a human, and with a build more suited for spacecraft controls than physical combat, he looked absurdly small next to the towering Valyrian champion. The contrast drew scattered laughter from some of the younger nobles, though the older ones watched with more serious expressions. The Circle of Honor was a raised platform in the center of the throne room, surrounded by energy barriers that would contain the combat. Ancient Valyrian law required that such challenges be fought with minimal weapons, relying primarily on natural strength and fighting skill. It was a tradition designed to showcase the physical superiority that had allowed the Valyrians to dominate so many other species. But Choi had no intention of playing by their rules. Security Chief Song Hye-jin had been monitoring Imperial communication networks for over a decade, watching for signs of rebellion or unrest among the Empire's many client species. She knew the usual patterns of dissent: whispered complaints about taxation, secret meetings of disgruntled merchants, occasional protests that were quickly crushed by Imperial forces. But what she was seeing now was completely different. The chatter started small, just curious discussions about the strange aliens who had defeated Champion Gorthak in ritual combat. But within days it had grown into something much more dangerous. Species that had been silent for centuries were suddenly talking openly about concepts that had never existed in their vocabulary before. On the mining world of Kethara, workers were asking why they couldn't elect their own supervisors instead of accepting Imperial appointees. The aquatic Silmari were questioning why their entire species was classified as a servant race when they had their own rich culture and history. Even some of the younger Valyrian nobles were privately discussing whether the Emperor's authority should be absolute or subject to some kind of limits. The most troubling reports came from the Imperial Academy, where Dr. Yoon Soo-jin had been invited to give lectures about human biology and culture. What started as scientific discussions had quickly turned into philosophical debates that were spreading far beyond the academy walls. Song watched the recorded sessions with growing alarm. Dr. Yoon wasn't trying to start a revolution. She was simply answering questions with the casual honesty that all humans seem to possess. When asked about human government, she explained democracy as naturally as she might describe the weather. When students inquired about human society, she talked about individual rights and personal freedom, as if these were basic facts of life rather than radical concepts. On Earth, we believe that every person has the right to make their own choices about their life, Dr. Yoon had said during one session. Our governments exist to serve the people, not the other way around. If a leader fails to represent the will of the citizens, they can be removed from office through peaceful elections. The young Valyrian scholars had listened with fascination, their minds clearly struggling to process ideas that went against everything they had been taught since birth. But it wasn't just the content of her words that was revolutionary. It was the way she spoke to them as equals, encouraging questions and treating their opinions with respect. Within weeks, underground discussion groups had formed on dozens of worlds throughout the Empire. They called themselves human circles, though most of the participants had never actually met a human. They shared poorly translated copies of human philosophical texts, debated concepts they barely understood, and began to imagine possibilities that had never occurred to them before. The military leadership was split on how to respond to this growing unrest. Admiral Krextol, commander of the 3rd Imperial Fleet, saw opportunity where others saw danger. He had been secretly meeting with engineer Lee Dong-woo, fascinated by the human approach to problem-solving and tactical thinking. "Your species treats warfare like an engineering problem," Krextol had observed during one of their clandestine conversations. "You analyze the situation, identify weaknesses, and find creative solutions. We've been fighting the same way for 1,000 years, following the same tactical manuals our ancestors used." Lee had shrugged, unaware that his casual attitude was itself revolutionary. Every problem has a solution if you look at it from the right angle. Sometimes the obvious approach isn't the best one. Why limit yourself to traditional methods when you could try something new? These discussions had led to informal experiments within Krextol's fleet, where junior officers were encouraged to suggest alternative strategies and question established procedures. The results had been remarkable. Response times improved, resource efficiency increased, and morale among the crew reached levels not seen in decades. But General Vortham, head of Imperial Intelligence, viewed the human influence as a disease that needed to be eliminated before it could spread further. His agents reported that the concepts of individual rights and democratic governance were spreading faster than any virus, infecting populations that had been stable for centuries. The breaking point came when 3 star systems in the Outer Rim declared independence on the same day, all referencing human principles of self-determination in their declarations. The Zekthari Confederacy, the Mordun Assembly, and the Free Worlds of Althea had never coordinated their actions before, but they had all been influenced by the same underground networks spreading human ideas. Emperor Vextar convened an emergency session of the Imperial Council, his usual calm demeanor cracking for the first time in living memory. The humans had been in Imperial space for less than 3 months, and already the foundations of his rule were shaking. "They're not conquerors," he said to his assembled advisors, his voice tight with frustration. "They're not even trying to overthrow us, but somehow, just by being themselves, they're destroying everything we've built." The reports kept coming in from across the Empire. Factory workers demanding better conditions, students questioning their textbooks, entire species beginning to imagine futures they had never dared to dream of before. The humans had accidentally started something that couldn't be stopped by force or propaganda, and in the Imperial Palace, a small group of humans continued their daily routines, completely unaware that their simple presence was reshaping the galaxy around them. Princess Thaisara had always been the perfect Imperial daughter, obedient, elegant, and completely devoted to maintaining the traditions that had kept the Valyrian Empire strong for over 2,000 years. But her conversations with Communications Officer Han Min Seo had planted seeds of doubt that grew stronger with each passing day. Han had never intended to start a political revolution. She was simply answering the princess's curious questions about human society with the same enthusiasm she brought to any academic discussion. When Thaisara asked how humans chose their leaders, Han explained elections as naturally as she might describe the weather. "So ordinary citizens actually vote for who leads them?" the princess had asked, her scaled brow furrowed in concentration. "And if the leader makes bad decisions, the people can choose someone else?" "Of course," Han had replied. "That's the whole point of democracy. The government works for the people, not the other way around. If a president or prime minister fails to represent what the citizens want, they get voted out in the next election." For someone raised to believe that absolute authority was divinely ordained, these concepts were earth-shattering. Thaisara began to notice things she had never questioned before. The way palace servants flinched when nobles walked by, the fear in petitioners' eyes when they approached her father's throne, the way entire species lived in poverty while imperial. Families enjoyed unimaginable luxury. The transformation became public during a formal court ceremony celebrating the conquest of the Meridian sector 50 years earlier. As her father delivered the traditional speech about imperial destiny and the natural order of strong ruling over weak, Princess Thaisara stood up from her ornate chair. "Father," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence of the throne room, "how do we know that our way is the only correct way? What if the species we rule would be happier governing themselves?" The gasps from the assembled nobles were audible. Several elderly courtiers looked as if they might faint from shock. Emperor Vextar's eyes flashed with fury, but before he could respond, his daughter continued. "The humans have shown us that societies can function without absolute rulers. Maybe we should consider whether our subjects truly consent to imperial rule, or if they simply have no choice but to accept it." The speech lasted only a few minutes, but its impact was immediate and devastating. Within hours, recordings of the princess's words were spreading through underground networks across the empire. If the emperor's own daughter could question his authority, what did that say about the foundation of imperial power? Noble families who had harbored private doubts for generations suddenly found their voices. Lord Kethmoran, whose family controlled 3 star systems, publicly called for a council of nobles to advise the emperor on major decisions. Duchess Velandra proposed that client species should have representatives in the imperial senate. Even some of the younger military officers began suggesting reforms to make the empire more responsive to its citizens' needs. Emperor Vextar's response was swift and brutal. He declared the humans to be dangerous revolutionaries who threatened the stability of the galaxy itself. The execution order came down through official channels, commanding all Imperial forces to eliminate the human threat immediately. But something unprecedented happened. Nearly half the Imperial military refused to obey. Admiral Krextol was among the first to openly defy the order. His message to fleet commanders throughout the Empire was simple. The humans have committed no crimes except showing us a better way to live. I will not be party to murdering innocents for the crime of thinking differently. General Sekthar of the 4th Legion joined the resistance, bringing 12 full regiments with him. Commander Yelnara of the Imperial Guard quietly began securing safe passage for human sympathizers. Even some of the palace guards, who had sworn personal loyalty to the Emperor, found themselves questioning orders they had never thought to disobey before. Captain Kim Tae-min found himself in an impossible situation. He had never wanted to lead a rebellion, but thousands of beings across the galaxy were looking to the humans for guidance. Species that had been enslaved for centuries were rising up, citing human principles they barely understood, but desperately wanted to embrace. The humans had no choice but to adapt to their new role as reluctant revolutionaries. Dr. Yoon Soo-jin used her scientific background to establish secure communication networks between resistance cells scattered across dozens of star systems. Her knowledge of biology helped her understand the different ways various species could contribute to the cause, matching each group's natural abilities with appropriate roles in the growing rebellion. Pilot Choi Jae-sung became an unlikely military instructor, teaching alien pilots techniques that had never been seen in formal Imperial warfare. Instead of the honorable head-to-head confrontations that Valyrians preferred, he showed them hit-and-run tactics, ambush strategies, and ways to use an enemy's size and strength against them. Engineer Lee Dong-woo's improvised weapons and defensive systems gave the rebellion capabilities that Imperial intelligence couldn't predict or counter. He taught resistance fighters how to build effective tools from common materials, how to sabotage Imperial equipment without being detected, and how to turn everyday objects into instruments of liberation. The war that followed was unlike anything the Empire had ever experienced. Instead of glorious battles between matched fleets, they faced 1,000 small conflicts that followed no predictable pattern. Imperial forces would arrive to crush a rebellion, only to find empty bases and civilians who claimed to know nothing about resistance activities. Star systems didn't fall to the rebellion through conquest. They simply declared independence and meant it. When Imperial forces tried to reassert control, they found populations that no longer feared their authority and military units that refused to fire on civilians fighting for basic freedoms. The Empire was crumbling not from external attack, but from the simple realization that there might be a better way to live. Legal scholar Velnara had spent her entire career studying the ancient laws that formed the foundation of the Valyrian Empire. Most of these regulations hadn't been used in centuries, gathering dust in forgotten archives, while the Empire relied on more modern methods of governance. But as the rebellion grew stronger and traditional authority crumbled, she found herself searching through texts that predated the current Imperial dynasty. What she discovered changed everything. The right of succession was older than the Empire itself, dating back to the tribal wars that had first united the Valyrian homeworld. It established a legal path for challenging Imperial authority that didn't require bloodshed or conquest. The law was complex and specific, requiring candidates to demonstrate 3 crucial qualities: victory in honorable combat, the ability to unite diverse groups under common cause, and leadership that inspired loyalty across species boundaries. Velnara realized with growing excitement that the humans had unknowingly fulfilled every requirement. Pilot Choi's defeat of Champion Gorthak satisfied the combat requirement. The rebellion itself proved their ability to unite different species, and their leadership had inspired loyalty from beings across the galaxy who had never even met them personally. When she presented her findings to the Imperial Council, the chamber fell silent. Emperor Vextar stared at the ancient documents, his expression shifting between disbelief and resignation. The same laws that gave him ultimate power now demanded that he acknowledge the humans' legal claim to challenge his throne. "This is impossible," General Vortham protested. The right of succession was written for Valerians challenging other Valerians. It was never intended for alien species. But Velnara had anticipated this objection. The original text specifically uses the phrase "any being of sufficient worth, Your Majesty." Our ancestors were wise enough to recognize that leadership qualities might emerge from unexpected sources. The Emperor had no choice. To ignore the ancient laws would undermine the very foundation of his authority. If he could dismiss legal traditions when they proved inconvenient, what would stop others from doing the same? With visible reluctance, he formally invoked the right of succession, calling for the 3 trials that would determine the humans' worthiness to rule. The trial of strength had been designed to showcase the physical superiority that Valerians believed made them natural rulers. Previous challengers had lifted massive stones, wrestled with dangerous beasts, or demonstrated their prowess with traditional weapons. Captain Kim took one look at the arena and knew that trying to match Valerian strength would be pointless. Instead, he did something that had never been attempted before. He invited representatives from every species in the rebellion to join him in the arena. Together, they moved obstacles that no individual could have handled alone. When faced with a puzzle that required both delicate manipulation and brute force, different species contributed their unique abilities to find the solution. The Valerian observers watched in fascination as tiny Silmari swimmers navigated underwater passages, while massive Ketharan miners provided the raw power needed to clear blocked tunnels. The humans coordinated the effort, but the real strength came from cooperation between species that had been enemies just months before. Dr. Yoon's trial of wisdom presented her with riddles and puzzles that had stumped imperial scholars for generations. These weren't simple math problems or logic games, but complex challenges that required deep understanding of physics, biology, and social dynamics. The imperial academics who had created these tests assumed that only beings with centuries of formal education could solve them. Dr. Yoon approached each puzzle with the scientific method she had learned on Earth. She formed hypotheses, tested them systematically, and wasn't afraid to admit when her first attempts failed. Where Valerian scholars had tried to solve the puzzles through pure intellectual force, she treated them as experiments to be understood rather than problems to be conquered. Her breakthrough came when she realized that many of the ancient puzzles contained clues about long-lost Valerian history. By applying archaeological principles and cross-referencing different challenges, she uncovered connections that revealed not just the solutions, but the cultural context that had inspired their creation. The trial of leadership was perhaps the most complex challenge ever devised by imperial law. The candidate had to coordinate a massive project involving multiple species, limited resources, and conflicting interests. Previous challenges had failed because they tried to impose their will through authority and commands. The human crew took a completely different approach. They spent days talking with representatives from different species, learning about their cultures, understanding their needs, and finding ways for everyone to contribute meaningfully to the project. Navigator Park Ji-hai worked with Silmari navigators to plot efficient supply routes. Engineer Lee collaborated with Ketharan builders to design structures that could accommodate different environmental needs. Communications Officer Han became the heart of the operation, facilitating discussions between groups that had never tried to work together before. Her enthusiasm for learning about different cultures helped break down barriers that had existed for centuries. When the project was completed ahead of schedule and under budget, with every participating species expressing satisfaction with the process, the imperial observers finally understood what made human leadership different. It wasn't about commanding obedience, but about inspiring cooperation. The trial's conclusion left Emperor Vextar facing an unprecedented situation. By law, he was required to abdicate his throne to the humans who had proven their worthiness to rule. But Captain Kim had been dreading this moment since the trials began. "Your Majesty," Kim said formally, "we don't want your throne. We never wanted to rule an empire. We just wanted to go home." The solution they proposed was revolutionary in its simplicity. Instead of accepting absolute power over billions of beings, the humans suggested transforming the empire into something entirely new. Each world would govern itself according to its own culture and needs, while contributing to a common defense fund and participating in trade agreements that benefited everyone. The Valerian Confederation was born not through conquest or revolution, but through negotiation and compromise. Former enemies became partners in a system that nobody had ever tried before. It wasn't perfect, and there were countless details to work out, but for the first time in galactic history, diverse species were working together as equals. Standing. In the throne room where their adventure had begun, Captain Kim looked at his crew and realized they had accomplished something far more important than their original mission. They hadn't just explored unknown space, they had helped create a better future for billions of beings. The new dawn was ready for the journey home, but Earth seemed less important now than the work still to be done among the stars.